John F. McManus joined the staff of the John Birch Society in August of 1966, serving originally as a field coordinator for several New England states. In 1968, he was transferred to a position in the Society's national headquarters. In 1973, he accepted an appointment by Robert Welch, the Society's founder, as the organization's Director of Public Affairs. In this post, he became and remains the Society's chief media representative throughout the nation. He has appeared on hundreds of radio and television programs. He is one of the Society's few authorized spokesmen. In addition to being a regular contributor of articles to the New American, he serves as its publisher. He is also publisher of the Society's member-only monthly bulletin, and he was named president of the John Birch Society in 1991. We welcome you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you giving up an evening of your time to come and listen to what we have to say, but of course, it was also a Tea Party meeting. I crashed it. We're going to talk about the possibility of a constitutional convention and why the John Birch Society is opposed to it. So we're going to put it under a microscope, I guess you could say. I want to start with lost awareness. This is something that I think all Americans should consider. That America became great not because of what government did, but because of what government was prevented from doing by the Constitution of the United States. I think if we had that more widely spread, that we'd be in a better shape as a country. The U.S. Constitution, of course, came right after the War for Independence was won, and it was finally ratified by a sufficient number of states in 1789, and it became the law of the land. In the middle of the 1800s, there's a couple of people who looked over the Constitution of the United States and threw some nice bouquets at it. William Gladstone was the Prime Minister of England, and in the 1860s, he said it's the greatest piece of work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man. And around that same time, Canada was getting into having a prime minister, and the very first prime minister of Canada, a man named John Macdonald, he said, "I think and believe that it is one of the most perfect organizations that ever governed a free people." That's pretty high compliments from people outside of the United States, and I think deserved. Glad to see them. What's the value of the Constitution? Well, it's a standard by which to measure performance of elected officials. The John Birch Society's magazine is called the New American, and we publish a roster of how did they vote, how did the senators vote, how did the representatives vote. And I put a copy of it right over here, just to show you. This is the New American magazine. And here's what we call the Freedom Index. The Freedom Index rates all congressmen and all senators, and we do all the congressmen on the same issues, all the senators on the same issues. This particular issue, we find a fellow named, your congressman here's name is Garrett?
Yeah,
He got 100%.
he's a good one.
10 votes, he voted the correct way. He voted the constitutional way on all 10 issues. Now, the Constitution is also a grant of limited power to the nation's federal government. Limited power, not all power, just limited. And it's a restrainer of the government's always voracious power grabbing. If the American people know about it, and if the American people force the congressman to obey the oath that they take every year, every start of every Congress. Now, just to give you an idea of what's going on, you probably already know this, but my favorite part of the Constitution of the United States is Article 1, Section 1, Sentence 1, right at the beginning, right after the preamble. It says, "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States." Now, if all legislative power is in the Congress, how much of it is in the Supreme Court? How much of it is in the executive branch? Right? I see you're all good mathematicians. You all figured that out, right? Law cannot be executed legitimately via presidential executive orders or court decisions. I don't know how many times I've been with people and they say, well, the job of the Supreme Court and the other federal courts is to interpret the Constitution. No, it isn't. It's not to interpret the Constitution. It's to obey the Constitution, and it's to make sure that other people obey it. And an awful lot of the matters that come before the Supreme Court and federal courts, they should say it's none of our business, it's not a federal matter, send it back to the states and let the people decide, right? I can remember when I was a boy growing up and I'd skin my knee and I'd come in bawling. My mother would look at me and she'd fix my knee and put a little bandage on it or something like that, and I'd still be bawling, and she always used to say, don't make a federal case out of it. We make a federal case out of everything, don't we? Right? Abuses and dereliction of duty, the war power belongs only in Congress. That war power hasn't been used since December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. The power to coin money is in the Constitution. Congress shall have power to coin money, not issue money. Coin money. And there's no power in the Constitution for the federal government to have a bank. Right? Protect the states from invasion. That's part of the Constitution. That's in Article, I think it's Article 4. It says that it shall be the duty of Congress to protect the states from invasion. And it didn't say military invasion. If you got 10 million people coming across the southern border, that's an invasion, isn't it? Right? It's the federal government's job to do something about that. They're derelict in their duty. And of course, they ignore the 10th Amendment, and then there's plenty more that we could go on and list here. But abuses and dereliction of duty is very common. Right? Now, I'm going to give you an example of how they ignore the Constitution. On October 3rd of 2002, and this was 6 months before the second invasion of Iraq. The first one happened under George H.W. Bush's administration. Now we're into years later. The House International Relations Committee met to discuss planning for the war already being discussed by the George W. Bush administration. All 45 members of this committee were there. Right? The Democrats and the Republicans, as well as others in Congress, and they'd all sworn an oath to abide by the entire Constitution. All right, so what happened? Well, at that meeting, a congressman named Ron Paul, he stood up and said, Mr. Chairman, I have a motion. I move that we declare war on Iraq, and I intend to vote against my measure because I don't think we should go to war against Iraq. But I also don't think we should ignore the constitutional requirement for a congressional declaration of war. Good for it. Good for you, Ron. Right? So what happened? Well, the chairman of the committee was Henry Hyde of Chicago, supposedly a great conservative. And this is what he said to Ron Paul. He said, there are things in the Constitution that have been overtaken by events, by time. Declaration of war is one of them. Your measure is inappropriate, anachronistic. It isn't done anymore. And he got away with it. Right? And so Ron's motion was defeated, and he even voted against it himself. Right? Now, there are parts of the Constitution that these kinds of people do obey, and one of them is that they shall be paid a salary for their time in office. They have not made that one overtaken. They have not said that that's inappropriate or anachronistic, right? They want that one to stay. So we had the Iraq War. We lost 4,484 people, men, Marines, soldiers, some sailors. 10 times more were wounded. And the results, Iraq is far worse off than if we'd never gone in there in the first place. But if we had a declaration of war, we would have won it, and we would have made sure that it stayed won. Now, the president makes law via executive orders. During the Clinton administration, there was a fellow named Paul Begala, and you'll see him every once in a while on the Sunday talk shows. He's supposedly an expert on things. And he actually one time, talking about executive orders, he said, stroke of the pen, law of the land, kind of cool. And he got away with it. He should have been fired on the spot. More executive orders. Our current president, Barack Obama, in his State of the Union speech 2 years ago, said, America does not stand still, and neither will I. So whenever I can take steps without legislation to expand opportunity for more Americans, that's what I'm going to do. Right? He's got to be stopped. So, all right, now I have a question for everybody. Do current government officials obey the limitations on their powers contained in the Constitution?
No.
No? Next question. Will current government officials who don't abide by the existing limitations in the Constitution honor any new amendment?
No.
So we don't need a new amendment. Okay. The real need is for better government officials, especially in the House of Representatives. Why do I say especially in the House of Representatives? Because Article 1, Section 7 says all bills for raising revenue must originate in the House of Representatives. If the House won't originate a bill for this or that or something else, that's it. There's nothing the Senate can do about it, nothing the President can do about it, the Supreme Court, even the New York Times can't do anything about it. So there's the real need. Now, the purpose of amendments to the Constitution should be to fix the Constitution where it's needed fixing. It's not to legislate. An amendment is not for legislation. Amendments should not be added to make or unmake laws. Right? Now, if you've made an amendment and you want to get rid of it, then you have to make another amendment to get rid of the first one. That happened once, didn't it? At Prohibition. It was decided, no, this is a mistake. So another amendment, and that canceled the Prohibition Amendment. So we have people now who want to amend the Constitution. They claim to want improvement, but the way they want to do it is through a constitutional convention that would open it up for a complete overhaul. They call for a constitutional convention. Constitution, in Article 5, the amendment procedure is laid out. There are two ways of having an amendment. The first is the way that has been used for 27 amendments. That's all we have, 27 amendments in the Constitution. And that's when 2/3 in both houses of Congress, 2/3 of the Senate, 2/3 of the House, agree to propose amendments. And then what they propose, if they pass it 2/3 in each house, it goes to the states and it must be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And they can either do that legislatively or they can do it in their own little convention in their state. Now, the second way of amending the Constitution, in Article 5, it says if 2/3 of the states petition Congress to create a con-con, all amendments resulting from that convention must be ratified by then 3/4 of the states. If the convention hasn't altered or abolished the ratification process. Right? Now, I'll mention that again because that's what happened to the Articles of Confederation. The U.S. Constitution, there are people who say what we want is a convention of the states. There's no authorization for a convention of the states in the Constitution of the United States. The procedures that I've just mentioned are the ways that you can go, and that's all. There's no mention of a convention of the states. And I run into people, some here and some there, across the country. They've been convinced that this is what we ought to do, a convention of the states. There's no authorization for it in the Constitution. Then there are people who say, well, we only want just a single amendment, right? You get a constitutional convention started, we only want one amendment. And what they usually talk about is a balanced budget amendment, right? But Article 5 states that a constitutional convention may be created by Congress to propose amendments. It's plural. So you can't limit a constitutional convention to just one issue, if you ever have one. There are false claims about a constitutional convention. There are claims that the states can propose amendments. No, the states can't propose amendments. No, not at all. Then it says the states can make the rules for a convention if the convention is convened. No, they can't do that either. The state delegations will function only as one state, one vote. There's no authorization for that anywhere. Then they say, well, the Supreme Court would stop a runaway convention. Now, I'm going to be using the term runaway convention because that's what happened in 1787. When a convention was held under the Articles of Confederation, which was our governing system at the time, and the directives were for them to amend the Articles of Confederation. What did they do? They threw out the Articles and they came up with a whole new Constitution. Could that happen today? Why not? Why couldn't it happen today? And are there people, I think, who are secretly behind the scenes wanting that power so that they can get rid of the Constitution and with it the Second Amendment and the 10th Amendment and all the other limitations on government? Yeah, I think so. So the Supreme Court can't stop it once it gets started. A constitutional convention is what you'd call a sovereign body. And it has all power. It can do whatever it wants. Ratification by the states. We've already mentioned this. The 1787 Con had a mandate only to alter the Articles of Confederation. But that Constitutional Convention canceled the Articles and even changed the requirement from unanimous approval of the amendments to only 3/4 of the states needed for approving amendments to the new Constitution and to adding any new amendments to it. So you can see that all power sits there. Now, we were very fortunate. We were very fortunate in that Constitutional Convention in 1787. There were people there like Washington and Madison and Hamilton and some of the other founding fathers who had only good government in mind. They didn't have any personal agenda that they wanted to put in it. Today, there would be all kinds of personal agendas if there was a constitutional convention. The Articles of Confederation in Article 13 actually said, and the Articles of this Confederation shall be inviolably observed by every state, and the Union shall be perpetual, nor shall any alteration at any time hereafter be made in any of them, unless such alteration be agreed to in a Congress of the United States and be afterwards confirmed by the legislature of every state. And so you can see that that was changed when they substituted a new constitution. It wasn't every state had to approve it, only 3/4. There are myths regarding a constitutional convention. The myths say states can control a con. They say proposed amendments can be limited to a single subject. Not at all. They say state ratification process will bar mischief if the state ratification process hasn't been cast aside by the convention. They say a con can't change the whole Constitution. Yes, it can. It did in 1787. And they say a convention of the states is allowed under Article 5. No, it is not. There's no such thing. So questions need answers. If you have a constitutional convention, how do you choose the delegates to go to it? Right? Are you going to send Senator Booker? Right? Right? Are you going to send Nancy Pelosi? Right? Are you going to send whoever, right? How many delegates per state? Is it going to be one delegate for each state? Or is it going to be like the Electoral College? The Electoral College, each state has a proportional number of people. Expenses to a constitutional, who's going to pay the expenses, right? I don't suppose that many of them would go if they weren't taken care of. Okay? And where are they going to hold the meeting? Well, I think Hawaii would be nice, especially if it's wintertime, right? Who's going to be the chairman, right? Where to hold the con? Who's going to worry about the safety of the delegates, right? You certainly would have to have it today in the kind of a situation we live in. So the answers. The Congress call a convention for proposing amendments. Right? Article 1, Section 8 grants power to Congress. Congress can call a constitutional convention. I don't want them to do it. But if they ever did, then the power goes to Congress to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers of that Article 1, Section 8, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. So the answer to all of the questions that we just posed, how to choose the delegates and so forth, Congress is the answer, right? And if you don't have a decent Congress, you have no idea what could happen. So who favors a constitutional convention? Oh, quick fix partisans. I always like to say that. People who say, okay, we're going to take care of all the problems, we're going to do a quick fix. No, quick fixes don't work. Mark Levin is in favor. He wrote a book about it. Limbaugh, Hannity, and Beck, they're in favor of a constitutional convention. The National Tax Limitation Committee is, the National Taxpayers Union, the Goldwater Institute out in Phoenix, Michael Farris of the Patrick Henry College, Tea Party Patriots, Wolfpack, George Soros. These people are all in favor of it, and some of them I think are pretty decent people, but they're wrong. I hate to say it, I think they're wrong about this. This guy, Michael Farris, I had an experience, it was about 18 months ago, to come down to New Jersey and to speak at a debate. Michael Farris versus John McManus. Well, when Michael Farris found out that John McManus was coming, he canceled. And then he went to Colorado and he told the people in Colorado that I canceled. Right? I don't think I want to trust that guy. Leftists who favor a con-con, the Young Turks, Harvard University's Lawrence Lessig, Alliance for Democracy, Code Pink, Independent Progressive Network, Progressive Democrats of America, that's Bernie Sanders, Sierra Club, and so forth. All right, who's an opponent of the con-con? James Madison was. Thomas Jefferson was. Phyllis Schlafly is. Edwin Vieira, constitutional attorney, who got his degree at Harvard, and he came out of Harvard. He got 4 degrees from Harvard. He came out of there, and he's a ringing conservative. I don't know what happened to him. He probably didn't pay attention in class. Tom DeWeese is an opponent. Former Justice Warren Burger, former Justice Arthur Goldberg, the late Judge Robert Bork, Professor Lawrence Tribe at Harvard, Charlie Rice, a good friend of mine who passed away recently at Notre Dame, Gerald Gunther at Stanford, and an opponent, the John Birch Society. Right? More opponents. These are on the left, some of them. American Civil Liberties Union, Federation of Teachers, Americans for Democratic Action, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, the NAACP, National Organization for Women, People for the American. Why are these people opposed to a con-con? Well, they're afraid that the Bill of Rights might be excluded. They're right. They're right. I agree. The Bill of Rights could be just blown away. Former Supreme Court Justice Warren Burger. He said this in a letter. The participants in the Constitutional Convention of 1787 had no authority to write a constitution. They were authorized only to revise the Articles of Confederation, but they paid no attention to that limit and wisely threw the whole thing away and produced the Constitution. Right? That's exactly my point of view. Justice Warren Burger, he wasn't opposed to adding amendments. He expressed his opposition only to a constitutional convention that would have power to void the entire Constitution. Right? Former Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg, he said any attempt at limiting the agenda of a convention would almost certainly be unenforceable. Right? Once begun, a con-con cannot be limited. Now, are there any good amendments that I would like to see? Yeah, I'd like to see repeal of the 16th Amendment with a new amendment, get rid of the federal income tax. I'd like to see repeal of Amendment 17, the direct election of senators, right, with another amendment. That's the way to get rid of those. Now, there aren't too many people who understand the importance of the direct election of senators, right? The Constitution was written so that the state would itself decide who to send to the Senate and not leave it up to the people. This was going to be the Senate was to be the guardians of the state powers. And that was done away with Article 17, Amendment 17. And so now we have two bodies of the House and the Senate, and they both are elected by the people. And there's nobody standing up for the rights of the states, right? Except an occasional constitutionalist, I guess. Now, we in the John Birch Society, we favor these kinds of amendments, but not via a con-con. They don't have to be during a con-con. Now, most of the people who want a con-con want it because they want to add a balanced budget amendment. You say balanced budget, you say, well, boy, it's about time. We need a balanced budget, right? We only have $19 trillion in debt, right? And it keeps growing, right? And of course, they don't factor in unfunded obligations, Social Security, Medicare, and so forth. Really, the indebtedness of the government of the United States is well beyond $100 trillion. Maybe as much as $200 trillion, an incomprehensible amount of money, right? So they say, well, we need a balanced budget amendment, okay? But every balanced budget amendment proposal that I've ever seen has built-in flaws. For instance, expecting government officials to honor an amendment when they already refuse to honor the Constitution makes no sense at all, right? Some balanced budget amendments allow 60% in Congress to override the need for a balanced budget. Some call for tax increases if the budget isn't balanced, right? That's one way of balancing the budget, isn't it? Raise your taxes. Even steering a taxing authority to the executive branch instead of the legislative branch. Some say that budget doesn't have to be balanced if there's a war or a national security threat or a crisis. Remember what Rahm Emanuel said? A crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Yeah, it's a terrible thing to waste. Right. So all I have to do is manufacture a crisis, and then bingo, you can override the balanced budget amendment. Some say the balanced budget amendment's provisions wouldn't take effect for 5 years, meaning more trillions of debt to the already enormous debt we have. Some say that the way to get around the deficit problem is to declare some huge expenditures off budget. They already do that, right? There are huge expenditures that don't even show up in the budget. Balanced budget amendments generally ignore the enormous deficit already accumulated, $19 trillion. Now, there are good ways to balance a budget. One, Congress can cut spending for unconstitutional programs. That would help to balance the budget. Another is that Congress can nullify laws and programs. The nullification power is there, and nobody wants to talk about it, except the John Birch Society and a few others. Rarely used power in Article 1, Section 7. I've already mentioned this. All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House. The power of the purse is in the House of Representatives. House members should use that power. Encourage your congressman to do it. What are some of the unconstitutional federal programs that should be abolished? Foreign aid. I defy anybody to find foreign aid in the Constitution of the United States. It's not there. Right? Education, housing, energy, medical care, undeclared war, and much more. All kinds of things that are being done are unconstitutional because there's no authorization for them in the Constitution. Then you have the added authority of Amendment 10. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people, right? The 10th Amendment is probably the most abused part of the Constitution, right? What about the Second Amendment, right? There are a lot of people interested in the Second Amendment. There are forces anxious to have a con-con in order to abolish the God-given right for private individuals to keep and bear arms. I'm not kidding you. That's why some people want a constitutional convention. All right, now let's talk about contrasting proposals here. If we use Article 1, Section 7 to cut spending, what do we need? We need a majority in the House of Representatives. That's 218. There are 435, so a majority, just over the 50%, would be 218 of them. We don't need any in the Senate. We have no role for state ratifications, so the total needed to balance the budget is 218 in the House of Representatives. If we create a balanced budget amendment, then we need 290 in the House, 67 in the Senate, and many hundreds in state governments, adding up to thousands of people that you need to have a balanced budget amendment added to the Constitution. So doesn't it make sense, right? Which would you choose? Isn't garnering of only 218 in the House easier than getting 290 in the House, 67 in the Senate, and the majorities in both houses of 38 state legislatures? Also, isn't the first method safer? Certainly is. So the safe and effective solution: elect reliable members to the House of Representatives, then the Senate, then the presidency. Now, as I travel the country, I meet people, I meet members of the Birch Society, I meet the people who come to hear what we have to say and so forth. And we're now in what I call the quadrennial spasm. Going to have another election of a president, right? And people come to me and say, who do you think is going to be the nominee? Who do you think is going to? I say, wait a minute, stop. We take our country back through the House of Representatives, and then the Senate, and then the presidency. Anybody who thinks that we're going to steal the presidency away from the powers that already have a grip on our government, they're just not thinking straight. Right? But the House of Representatives is something we can affect and something we can use. And the power of the people to elect a decent representative for the House of Representatives remains. All I can say is use it. If you have a good congressman, make sure you keep him. If you don't, then work to get somebody better. James Madison was the 4th president of the United States. He was the father of the Constitution. That's what his title has been. Right? He took the notes at the 1787 convention. He authored part of the Federalist Papers, the essays that went out to the farmers in New York State to get them to understand what the Constitution was all about. The essays were written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay. Right? And you know, I've had an experience where I had a bunch of college graduate people, and I said, well, we're going to study the Constitution. So everybody get a copy of the Federalist Papers. I had a pile of them there, and they had to pay for them, and they did. I said, let's start off with Federalist number, I've forgotten, 30, 40, whatever it was, right? And we'll meet again next week and we'll talk about it. Okay, good. Came back the next week and every single one of those college graduates said it was too difficult reading. But the Federalist Papers were written for the farmers in New York State in 1788. Most of those farmers never went to school, and they certainly understood what they were reading. How far we have come. Right? James Madison was the author of the Bill of Rights, not the sole author, but one of them. He became a member of Congress, and he was a strong opponent of another con. He had gone through the first. In essay number 40 in the Federalist Papers, he said, the authority given to conduct a Philadelphia Convention was limited and was for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. They went beyond their mandate because a constitutional convention is essentially a sovereign body. It can do whatever it wants, and therefore it's very dangerous. And that's why we've never had one in the history of our country. James Madison, regarding a constitutional convention, he said, having witnessed the difficulties and dangers experienced by the first convention, which assembled under very propitious circumstances, I should tremble for the result of a second. Right? What were the propitious circumstances? One of them was George Washington was there and he was in charge. Right? And when he would walk into the room, everybody hushed. Right? They so revered George Washington for good reasons. Right? That was one of the propitious circumstances. The other was they met behind closed doors. Right? And after they finished, Benjamin Franklin came out. He was met on the sidewalk by a woman who said, "Well, sir, what have you given us?" And he said, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." If you can keep it, right? How many people today would say, "Oh, we live in a democracy"? Look back on the table back there, you'll see a little booklet that I wrote about the difference between a republic and a democracy, right? If you don't know it, get yourself a copy of that booklet. Another comment came from Judge Robert Bork, who's deceased, of course. He's in our time. He said, "It is my view that a federal constitutional convention could not be limited to a single issue. The original Philadelphia Convention went well beyond the purposes for which it was called, and nobody has suggested the Constitution is a nullity for that reason." Right. Good thinking again. I got into this already. Interpret the Constitution. It's an error to believe that the duty of the Supreme Court and lower federal courts is to interpret the Constitution. No. No. Their task is to rule that a measure is or is not constitutional. And most of their decisions should state it's none of our business. Right? We wrongly allow leaders to make a federal case out of virtually everything. So the movement on to a constitutional convention got going, and then the John Birch Society said, "Hey, this is getting a little bit out of hand. We better get involved in this thing." And our people persuaded the legislatures in all of those different states mentioned there to rescind a call for a constitutional convention that they had already made. If we hadn't done that, they would have gone past the number to have a constitutional convention. Right. So all of those states that are mentioned there had a constitutional convention call made legitimately, and then they decided, based on information they were supplied, mostly by members of the Birch Society, that it's not a good idea, and they withdrew their thing. They call it rescission. Now, the other thing you can do is nullification. Several years ago, Congress enacted what they call the Real ID Act. Right? Everybody was going to have a new federal ID, right? And the states were going to have to pay for it. A lot of the states said, "Sorry, federal government, we're not going to do it." And we still don't have a Real ID Act, right? And there's movement to bring it back again, to have it, and let's do it again. 24 states refused to implement it. That's nullification, and therefore it never has been done. That's the power that the states have to stop the federal government from encroaching on their rights and their privileges. Right? Nullification. Numerous cities have declared sanctuary city status and ignored federal laws regarding illegal immigrants. Right? Now, I'm not in favor of that, but that's an example of nullification as well. Thomas Jefferson said that a nullification by those sovereignties, states, of all unauthorized acts done under the color of that instrument, the Constitution, is the rightful remedy. Right? I agree. There's a book, a wonderful book by a good friend of mine named Tom Woods. He's another Harvard grad who came out of there, and his first step out of Harvard was with his right foot, not his left foot. Right? His book, it's just, the title of it is Nullification. Been praised by Judge Andrew Napolitano. He's a Jersey boy, isn't he? Yeah. Columnist Walter Williams, Barry Goldwater Jr., the John Birch Society, numerous others. I've read the book. It's about 240 pages, but the second half of it is all appendix. So you got 120 pages, and he explains what nullification is and where it came from and who backed it and so forth. It's a quick read. James Madison, regarding nullification, he said nullification of a law can belong rightfully to a single state as one of the parties of the Constitution, the state not ceasing to avow its adherence to the rest of the Constitution. Right? Summarizing, a con-con is constitutionally legitimate, but a con-con cannot be limited and therefore is to be feared. Wisdom has prevented creation of a con-con for the past 220 plus years. Alternatives to a con include forcing Congress to abide by its solemn oath, nullification of unconstitutional measures by the states. All right? The effect on the Constitution. A con, look down on the left, a con can alter the Constitution, can rewrite the Constitution, and is dangerous. Go to the right. Nullification can enforce the Constitution, leave it as it is, and there's no danger involved. Right? Which do you choose? Conclusion. A constitutional convention, even if someone promotes the idea by some other name, like a Constitution of the States, would likely lead to a revision of the complete or complete cancellation of the Constitution. So we say, and we say very emphatically, say no to a con. Right? Now, something came up recently that I think deserves a little attention here. In 1944, a man named Willis Stone proposed an amendment to the Constitution. And his proposal was adopted by the John Birch Society. It sought to have government sell unconstitutional enterprises that are so many and so large that if you got rid of them all, you could cancel the income tax, right? That's why the John Birch Society was interested in it, right? And our people were as well. But Willis Stone's, his strategy was to have state legislatures call for a con, right? And we backed what he was in favor of years ago, and now that's being held against us because they don't know the whole story, right? Willis Stone said when the number of calls nears 2/3 and therefore a con would actually be conducted, he said that's the time when we tell Congress, you step in and you get yourself a constitutional convention. No, you ratify the amendment and don't go to a constitutional convention, right? Now, how do we know that? I got friendly with Willis Stone. He tried to get me to become the Liberty Amendment chairman for the state I live in, right? But I was already involved heavily with the John Birch Society. I said, look, I don't have time for anything else. He said, okay. I said, but I'll talk it up whenever I can. Willis Stone said this: no, we don't want a constitutional convention. Nobody would be stupid enough to want a con. We want Congress to propose the amendment, and even they would propose the amendment when we got close to where a con would have to be called. Right? So it's been stated that the John Birch Society is a bunch of hypocrites. They used to be in favor of a constitutional convention, and now they're opposed. No, we were never in favor of a constitutional convention. We were in favor of Willis Stone's strategy. And his strategy was to get a lot of states to call for a con up to getting close to where the tipping point would be, and then stop it. Okay, so there's a good look at the Constitutional Convention subject, and we can certainly take some questions if you have any. But I want to repeat, lost awareness. America became great not because of what government did, but because of what government was prevented from doing by the Constitution, right? If all of you would try to remember that, right, then you would understand why we're in favor of it. So who do you listen to? John Birch Society loves the Constitution enough to want to preserve it. Con promoters, some calling their proposal a convention of the states, claim to love it, but they would endanger its very existence by going to a con. So what should you do? All of you, you should choose good leadership, right? You got to watch out for neoconservatives. Now I'm going to give a little commercial here. 4 of my speeches have been made into DVDs, and one of them is on the subject of the neocon agenda, the neoconservatives. One is on stopping the New World Order. One is on the architects of the New World Order, and another is why the U.S. should get out of the United Nations, right? All 4 of these DVDs in a package back there on the book table, $10 for the whole package, right? Should you go for neoconservatives? No. Should you go for rhinos? I think you all know what a rhino is, Republican in name only, right? Should you go for unreliable politicians? No. Establishment leftists? Of course not. If you're looking for leadership, why not the John Birch Society? Just imagine several hundred well-informed and well-organized citizens spreading sound information in their own congressional district. Right? Then in hundreds of congressional districts. That's the goal of the John Birch Society. Right? It has already worked in several areas. There are people in Congress, and there have been for many years, people in Congress who know that they got their seat in Congress because of the educational work of the John Birch Society. We never told anybody to vote for them. We never told anybody to vote against the other guy. No, we don't do that. We're like what you said here at the beginning of your meeting, right? But we're interested in is spreading good information and then let people decide. We even say, you know, there might be some people who like big government. Well, good. Then move to Massachusetts, right? If you don't like big government and you want government limited, you know what to do. The John Birch Society's motto is less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world, right? How much less government? The amount allowed by the Constitution of the United States. Right? More responsibility. Where do we go for responsibility? How about the Ten Commandments? Right? That combination, the Constitution of the United States and the Ten Commandments, that would be a wonderful return, wouldn't it? We ought to get back to that. That's, somebody says, hey, that's a good idea. Let's get back to that, right? And there's my talk. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Right.